Before there was sound, before wind, before the sigh of rivers or the hum of stars, there was only stillness. The kind of stillness so complete that even the idea of silence had not yet been born. The earth was not yet earth. It was a swirl of fire and dust suspended in the endless sea of space, half dream, half memory of the stars that came before it. Time itself had not yet found rhythm. Every second was both an eternity and an instant. In that quiet expanse, creation waited, unmeasured, unhurried, for something to take form. From the scattered remains of dying stars, elements drifted through the void, drawn together by gravity's invisible pull. Hydrogen whispered to oxygen, iron fell toward the center, and the first heartbeat of a world began to tremble beneath the weight of its own becoming. The young planet spun in molten solitude, wrapped in heat and chaos. Every eruption, every collision was part of a cosmic symphony still too young to understand its own music. There was no watcher, no listener, only matter learning, through pressure and time, how to exist. In the vast silence of that early universe, nothing yet called this place home. No green, no blue, no breath. The molten seas glowed red beneath a sky of ash and vapor. The planet's crust shuddered and hardened, only to break and reform again. Volcanoes breathed out gases that would one day cradle life, though that purpose was still unimaginable. The air was poison, the surface a storm of fire. And yet, within this fierce, formless beauty, something sacred was unfolding, the patience of beginnings. The beauty is awareness. Then, at this stage, Earth was still sleeping. It did not yet know the colors that would one day wash across its mountains or the delicate pattern of rain. But perhaps, even in that early violence, there was a kind of unconscious grace, the way chaos sculpted itself toward harmony without knowing why. The planet's heartbeat was deep and slow, a rhythm older than breath, pulsing beneath the molten crust. It was the music of becoming, the first chapter of wonder written in fire. The silence surrounding the young Earth was not emptiness but potential. The universe itself was listening, waiting to see what this new world would become. And slowly, the noise of creation softened. The fiery storms began to quiet. The crust cooled, the skies began to clear, and the first oceans whispered against the still hot rock. In that meeting of elements, fire yielding to water, chaos softening into rhythm, the planet exhaled. It was the first breath, the first hint of balance. In the stillness that followed, there was no observer, no consciousness to marvel at the transformation. Yet if one could have listened closely, beneath the hiss of steam and the sigh of forming clouds, one might have heard something faint, a murmur, a longing. The planet was beginning to rest. It was beginning to settle into itself. Though unaware, it was already beautiful, not in the way a flower or a sunrise is beautiful, but in the way truth is beautiful, silent, patient, inevitable. And so, in the great hush that followed the universe's violent beginning, Earth waited. It did not yet know the meaning of reflection or the shape of wonder. But it carried within it all the ingredients of awareness, oceans to cradle life, minerals to build form, and sunlight to ignite color. The stage was set, though the actors were still asleep beneath the waves of time. This was the quiet before wonder, the long inhale before the first song of life. A world unaware of itself, but already writing the story of what it would someday see, the moment it would open its eyes and recognize its own beauty.
There is a kind of intelligence in patience. Long before minds emerged to think, the earth already knew how to wait. It learned to shape itself not through haste, but through the slow, deliberate rhythm of pressure and heat. The chaos of its fiery youth cooled into form. The violence softened into structure. Stone began to dream of mountains. Minerals folded and fused, creating the bones of continents. The young world, once molten and restless, started to sculpt its own body in silence, not out of intention, but out of endurance. Deep within its core, the planet burned with quiet resolve. Iron sank, anchoring gravity's grip, while lighter elements rose to form a crust. Volcanoes breathed their smoky hymns into the sky, their eruptions both destruction and renewal. Every mountain, every valley, every basin was carved not by plan, but by persistence. It was a choreography of time and temperature, of forces so immense they could only be measured in epochs. Beneath the violent surface, order began to emerge from chaos, structure from storm, symmetry from accident. And though no eyes yet watched, the world was already composing its first landscapes. Continents drifted like slow thoughts. Beneath the oceanic crust, tectonic plates inched past one another, colliding, tearing, merging again. Entire mountain ranges rose from their meeting, then wore away into sand over millions of years. Rivers that did not yet exist would one day carry that sand back to the sea, beginning the endless cycle of erosion and rebirth. This was not randomness, but a kind of patient intelligence written into the planet's physics. The Earth was learning balance, testing the fragile relationship between solidity and change. Every earthquake, every landslide, every shifting plate was part of a larger conversation, the language of matter learning to listen to itself. The surface cooled enough for the first crust to harden, only to break again under its own weight. Lava poured and solidified, cracked, and reformed. Over time, the crust thickened. The jagged continents floated like islands of thought on a sea of molten memory. The air above still shimmered with heat, heavy with gases, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, the breath of a world in transformation. There was no blue yet, no green, no softness. But the first hints of stability had arrived. The Earth was becoming not just a sphere of matter, but a structure capable of holding story. Each moment of geological change carried its own strange poetry. The cooling of magma was a kind of meditation, the folding of rock a slow gesture of acceptance. Through destruction came refinement, through fracture, new possibility. In this ancient dialogue between fire and stone, the Earth began to know endurance as art. If beauty is harmony between chaos and calm, then these first tectonic centuries were its earliest lessons in grace. The world was learning, without intention, the delicate balance between movement and stillness, the secret rhythm that would one day cradle life. Above, the sky thickened with clouds. The first rains fell, sizzling against the hot crust and rising back as steam, cycling endlessly in a baptism of vapor. For millions of years, the Earth's surface steamed inside, breathing through volcanic mouths and shifting crusts. These were the deep-time seconds of creation, every droplet, every grain of ash, a tiny verse in a poem too vast to read all at once. And though no consciousness yet existed to call it beautiful, beauty was already taking shape, the shimmer of minerals, the curvature of a horizon, the glow of molten rock cooling in twilight. Time was not measured yet. Ages passed like single exhalations. Continents wandered apart and returned. Oceans opened and closed. Mountains rose and dissolved into plains. The Earth was practicing impermanence, testing the boundaries of its own transformation. In these patient acts of change, it was sculpting the landscapes that would one day cradle forests, rivers, and cities. Everything to come, every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of human reflection, would depend on this ancient choreography of stone and fire. In its stillness, the Earth was not silent. The deep tectonic rumble beneath the crust was a heartbeat, constant and strong. The molten currents within its mantle moved like thought, invisible but persistent. The planet was alive in its own way, not with awareness, but with energy, rhythm, and purpose. Its beauty did not yet require eyes. It existed in the language of pattern and endurance. Over billions of years, those patterns became the foundations of harmony. Symmetry in crystal lattices, rhythm in seasonal cycles, elegance in erosion. Nature, without consciousness, was already composing the laws of aesthetics. If one could listen through time, one might hear the faint murmur of the Earth's first wisdom, that all things, no matter how chaotic, move toward balance. The same patience that forged mountains would one day guide the beating of hearts, the flowing of rivers, the slow drift of stars across a night sky. What was born in fire would evolve into calm. What was shaped in pressure would one day hold life with gentleness. The Earth, through the discipline of time, was learning to become soft again. The patience of stone, the humility of erosion, the endurance of continents. These were the Earth's first expressions of art. Long before color or sound, before life or awareness, beauty existed here as structure, as rhythm, as balance. And though the planet could not yet see itself, it was already forming the language through which it would one day recognize itself. A quiet intelligence hidden in pressure, a whisper encoded in the veins of rock, waiting for eyes to open and name it. The fire had quieted. The crust had cooled. The storms of molten rock that once tore the surface apart began to give way to gentler rhythms. The condensation of vapor, the forming of clouds, the slow and sacred descent of rain. It fell not in minutes or hours, but over centuries, in endless waves of vapor turned to water, hissing against hot stone and rising again as steam. The planet, still trembling from its fiery youth, was wrapped now in mist, a soft veil drawn across its face. And from that veil, the oceans were born. In the beginning, the seas were not blue. They were dark, heavy with dissolved minerals, metallic, and thick like liquid memory. They reflected no sky, for the sky itself was still young, a haze of carbon, methane, and ammonia. Yet beneath that opaque shroud, something astonishing stirred. The world that had been carved by fire now began to be shaped by water. Drop by drop, storm by storm, the earth was learning how to dream. The oceans became its first subconscious, vast, deep, and unknowable. Water is the great listener. It carries memory. It holds vibration. It reflects without judgment. As the rains continued to fall, carving valleys, filling craters, and dissolving stone into salt, they created not only a new landscape, but a new kind of possibility. Beneath the waves, chemistry began to whisper toward biology. The elements that had once burned in the crucibles of stars now danced in the quiet tide pools of a cooling planet. Hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, the alphabet of existence, began arranging themselves into patterns that hinted at something miraculous: self-replication. In the still depths, where sunlight could not yet reach, molecules began to link and twist. They folded into spirals, loops, and chains, capturing energy, dividing, reforming. There was no consciousness here, not yet, only the echo of it, the seed of what would one day be awareness. These early chemical dances were not yet life, but they were rehearsal. The earth, through its oceans, was experimenting with reflection, the act of becoming something more than matter. The seas were its canvas, the waves its heartbeat, the salts and silicates its palette. From chaos, order. From reaction, rhythm. Millions of years passed in silence. The oceans, restless and infinite, continued their slow work of creation. They absorbed heat, moderated the planet's breath, and began shaping weather. The long exhalations of evaporation and condensation that would one day define climate and season. The tides, pulled gently by the newborn moon, gave the earth its first sense of rhythm, its first pulse. Night and day had already begun their dance. Now the seas began their own, a liquid meditation on time. In this ceaseless motion, the world found its calm. If the mountains were the planet's bones, then the oceans were its dreams. They reached everywhere, touching every coastline that would ever exist, sculpting the world's contours in slow, deliberate patience. Beneath their surface, heat from the planet's interior created vents that hissed with minerals and energy. Around these black smokers, life's first whispers gathered, molecules meeting, bonding, testing endurance. No light, no air, no sound, only chemistry guided by chance and persistence. Yet from this darkness, the first biological spark flickered. It was not a being, but a becoming, a tiny pulse in the infinite sea. In that moment, something irreversible occurred. The universe, through this quiet, blue world, learned how to build from itself. Life was no longer an accident of matter, but an expression of curiosity. The oceans held this mystery close, guarding it like a secret dream. For billions of years, they would nurture it in silence. Organisms too small to see, too fragile to name, floating in the womb of the world. The earth, through its waters, was beginning to reflect upon itself, though dimly, unconsciously. as if dreaming of its own face before mirrors were invented. The surface shimmered with storms. Lightning flashed through the thick air, striking the waves, charging them with energy. Every bolt was a brief illumination of potential, nature's first experiments in complexity. The electricity of the sky met the chemistry of the sea, and together they composed the first sentences of life's long poem. These early seas did not simply host existence. They became the very substance through which thought would one day arise. In every droplet, in every wave, there existed the possibility of memory, the trace of something that could learn to see. To the universe, these oceans were unremarkable, one planet among billions, one experiment among countless others. But to the earth, they were everything. They gave it weight, reflection, and rhythm. They turned chaos into cradle, fire into flow. In their depths, pressure and temperature wove together like threads, crafting the delicate tapestries of amino acids, lipids, and sugars, the architecture of being. Slowly, invisibly, the boundary between chemistry and life blurred. The first cell walls began to form. The first chains of RNA began to copy themselves. The earth was beginning to speak in code. If one could listen to those ancient tides, one might not hear sound, but feel intention. The seas did not think, yet they contained the logic of thought. The currents moved as neurons might one day fire, exchanging, reacting, connecting. The ocean's turbulence was both random and purposeful, its eddies like synapses flickering in the mind of a sleeping god. Through the rhythm of waves and the cycles of evaporation and rain, the planet began to establish its own consciousness, not yet human, but elemental. A dreaming earth, breathing through water. As eons passed, the first photosensitive molecules formed, pigment-like chemicals that responded to light. They absorbed energy from the faint sun, filtering through the clouds, transforming photons into chemical possibility. With that subtle act, the planet began to notice brightness, though not yet to see it. The oceans had created their own eyes in miniature, primitive, unthinking, but open to light. The planet was beginning to awaken slowly, through its own reflection, through the shimmer of sunlight on the surface of the sea. The earth, once a child of fire, now found its soul in water. The oceans were both its memory and its imagination. They carried the minerals of the mountains, the gases of the sky, the warmth of the inner core, everything woven together in motion and depth. And somewhere, in the smallest flicker of molecular persistence, awareness began to gather like a tide. The planet did not yet know it was beautiful, but the moment was coming. For in the long sleep of oceans, Earth had begun to dream, and all dreams, sooner or later, awaken. It began in darkness, a whisper beneath the waves, too quiet for sound, too small for sight. Somewhere in the vast and silent ocean, a fragile pattern of molecules began to replicate. What had once been chemistry became intention. What had once been reaction began to remember. The earth, through this fragile arrangement of atoms, was beginning to speak in a new language, the language of life. It was not a shout, not a thunderclap of creation, but a murmur, a breath. The first cells divided, and in doing so, the planet took its first hesitant step toward knowing itself. These first beings were not aware of beauty. They did not dream or wonder or look toward the light with meaning. But within their membranes, something extraordinary stirred, a rhythm, a continuity. They carried the instructions of their own becoming, the knowledge of how to persist. Each replication was a small act of defiance against entropy, a soft declaration, I will continue. And in that simple persistence, life became the Earth's first reflection, the planet's attempt to see itself through motion, through pattern, through endurance. For millions of years, these microbial lives lived and died unseen. They floated through the oceans, drawing energy from minerals, sunlight, and heat. Some clustered together, forming colonies. Others drifted alone, dividing endlessly into the currents. There was no hierarchy, no predator, no prey, only the quiet symphony of survival. And though primitive, this early biosphere began to change everything. The once quiet oceans filled with microscopic motion, each cell stirring the water, altering its chemistry, creating the first global balance between life and matter. The Earth began to breathe differently. The early microbes that learned to harvest sunlight, cyanobacteria, changed the world more profoundly than any storm or volcano. Through photosynthesis, they began to exhale oxygen, a gas that would eventually reshape the sky and transform the chemistry of the seas. For the first time, light was not only warmth but sustenance. The planet had found a way to turn radiance into rhythm, to transform sunlight into memory. Slowly, the atmosphere brightened. The blue of the oceans deepened. What had been only chemical became biological, and what had been only reaction became expression. The great oxygenation event was both miracle and tragedy. As oxygen filled the air and seas, it poisoned the older forms of life that had thrived in its absence. Countless species perished. Yet from that destruction came renewal. The earth, through death, made room for transformation. Oxygen became the breath of all that would come after, the spark that would later ignite muscle, fire, and thought. It was the first of many lessons the planet would learn about beauty, that creation and loss are never separate, that the same force that gives life also takes it away. From the perspective of the universe, this might have been a trivial event, mere molecules shifting energy states. But within that molecular dance, something sacred unfolded. These early cells were building complexity, creating webs of exchange, cooperation, and interdependence. They began forming microbial mats and stromatolites, layered structures that grew toward the sun, leaving behind ancient signatures of the first communal existence. Through these formations, the Earth recorded its own biography in stone, page upon page of evolution etched in mineral and time. It is tempting to think of life as something separate from the planet, but here, in these early seas, the two were indistinguishable. The Earth was not a stage for life, but a participant in it. The cycles of weather, the tides, the minerals, all were collaborators in the grand experiment of persistence. Each cell that absorbed sunlight or released oxygen was part of a vast planetary metabolism. Through them, the Earth began to regulate its own temperature, shape its own climate, and compose its own chemistry. The living and the non-living became one continuous fabric, woven together by necessity and chance. As eons passed, these tiny architects laid the foundation for all future complexity. Through symbiosis, some cells merged, one enveloping another, not as predator and prey, but as partners. Within these unions, new powers emerged. Mitochondria that generated energy, chloroplasts that captured light. These internal collaborations marked a profound shift. The Earth, through its living matter, was learning cooperation, an early whisper of empathy, encoded not in thought, but in biology. Survival was no longer only competition, it was connection. And perhaps, if the planet had been aware, it might have felt something in this moment, a sense of recognition, a flicker of pride. For through these microscopic unions it was building the future, the plants that would paint its surface green, the animals that would one day run across its plains, the minds that would look back at the stars and wonder where it all began. Each cell was a small experiment in awareness, a note in a growing symphony of being. The Earth's unconscious mind was stirring, dreaming through biology. With time, the diversity of life expanded. New forms arose, some feeding on sunlight, others on the chemical energy of the deep. Some floated freely, others clung to rock and sediment, forming carpets of color on the ocean floor. The planet's skin began to shimmer with life, subtle and vibrant. These were the first hints of the artistry that would one day define the Earth's beauty. Patterns repeating, structures self-organizing, symmetry emerging from simplicity. What the planet did by accident would one day be recognized by minds as design. The atmosphere thickened with oxygen, transforming from haze to clarity. For the first time, sunlight reached the surface without distortion, scattering into blue. The seas reflected it, and the sky mirrored it back. The world that had once been gray and red began to glow with color. It was as though the Earth was dressing itself, preparing to be seen. And though no eyes existed yet to witness it, the transformation was profound. The planet was no longer asleep. It was beginning to stir beneath its own reflection. In this long awakening, the Earth began to learn rhythm, day and night, light and shadow, birth and decay. Life did not move quickly, but it moved surely, following invisible rules written in the geometry of molecules. Every generation of cells built upon the last, refining complexity, deepening interaction. The biosphere was still microscopic, yet its influence stretched across continents. The planet's chemistry was now inseparable from its biology, the living world shaping the physical one nurturing the living. It was the first dialogue of existence, the first whisper of self-awareness in matter. If beauty is the alignment of chaos into meaning, then this was the first moment that meaning began to form. Life, though blind, had direction. It was not yet capable of reflection, but it carried the potential for it. The Earth was still not conscious, but its dream was changing. In the murmur of waves, in the shimmer of sunlight through ancient waters, in the gentle respiration of microbes exchanging gases, the planet was rehearsing awareness. It was not yet looking at itself, but it had learned how to respond, how to listen. And so, as the oceans continued their endless motion and the continents slowly drifted, the world's pulse grew stronger. The air was alive with oxygen, the seas alive with chemistry, the crust alive with motion. The Earth, once a silent sphere of stone and fire, was now a living body, breathing, evolving, becoming. Through the smallest forms imaginable, it had learned its first truth, that to exist is to change, and to change is to awaken. Life had whispered back. The silence of creation was answered softly by persistence. The planet, without knowing it, had found its voice. And though awareness was still far away, still hidden in the deep corridors of time, the first reflection had begun. The Earth was no longer only a place where things happened. It was now a being in process, slowly learning to recognize the wonder of its own becoming. Life began not with thunder or grand spectacle, but with whispers in the dark. Deep within ancient oceans, where sunlight could not reach and warmth came only from the Earth's own breath, the first spark of life stirred. It was not a creature, not yet a thought, but a pattern. Molecules meeting by chance, forming bonds, breaking, reforming again. The sea was a vast cradle of experiments, every wave a memory of creation, every current a quiet question. What does it mean to live? The early Earth had cooled enough for oceans to settle into their blue depths, yet the air still shimmered with volcanic breath. The sky was copper and mist, heavy with gases that would have choked the fragile lungs of anything born too soon. But under the pressure of that dense atmosphere, and within the mineral-rich waters, life found a chemistry that worked. It did not bloom overnight. It pulsed slowly, a rhythm of molecules finding companionship, of elements learning how to hold each other long enough to make something new. From the vents in the ocean floor, minerals flowed like liquid silver, mixing with heat and salt to create small worlds within the darkness. These hydrothermal vents were laboratories of creation, where energy and matter danced in delicate balance. There, within microscopic chambers, bubbles of organic compounds began to cluster, forming membranes, thin boundaries between inside and outside. That was the first lesson of life, to separate, to define oneself from the vastness. The second lesson was endurance. A single molecule became two. Two became four. Patterns repeated, broke, and reformed. Some survived the next wave, others dissolved into memory. Through countless failures, the sea learned persistence. The code of life, fragile, mutable, endlessly inventive, began to write itself in the language of atoms. No audience watched this quiet miracle. No voice declared it sacred. Yet in the silence of that unseen hour, the Earth took its first breath through the gills of chemistry. Time, then, stretched like an endless tide. Millions of years passed in what would later be remembered as a single blink of creation. The first cells, tiny, invisible, yet infinitely complex, floated in the womb of the planet. They were the architects of everything to come: forests, oceans, animals, thought. Within their trembling walls lay the blueprint of consciousness, though they themselves knew nothing of it. To them, existence was not survival or awareness, it was simply being. There was poetry even in their simplicity. Each cell mirrored the world that birthed it, a sphere containing chaos and harmony, energy and stillness. They consumed the minerals of the sea, multiplied, and drifted. Over ages, some learned to harvest light, turning sunlight into food, into energy, into promise. From that transformation, the sky began to change. Oxygen filled the air, reshaping the very breath of the planet. With every invisible exhalation of those ancient cells, the Earth became more alive. If the planet could feel, perhaps it would have shivered at this awakening, a tremor of realization that something new now pulsed across its oceans. Life was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, faint but growing, woven into every drop of water and every grain of sediment. The Earth had given birth to something that could change it. And yet, this moment, the beginning of biology, of memory, of being, was not marked by celebration or awareness. It was quiet, patient, inevitable. The beauty of this early life was not in its complexity, but in its persistence. The same chemical hum that began in those dark waters still echoes today in every heartbeat, every breath, every thought. The Earth did not yet know it was beautiful, but something within it, in every cell that divided, in every molecule that survived another tide, was beginning to remember. Beauty was being written, not in light or color yet, but in the language of endurance. The story of life had begun, and it would be told not in noise, but in the soft rhythm of things that refused to end. The world was still young when the oceans began to breathe in color. For billions of years, life had existed only as whispers beneath the waves, simple, unseen, and patient. But now, the surface began to shimmer with new forms. Algae bloomed in green tides, spreading across the shallows like the first brushstrokes on a blank canvas. The sunlight, once harsh and meaningless, now had purpose. It fell upon these fragile pioneers and was transformed, light into life, radiance into rhythm. For the first time, the planet began to glow from within. It was the age of quiet invention. Life learned to build itself in new shapes, filaments, shells, threads of living lace. These small beings, invisible to the eye, rewrote the very chemistry of the atmosphere. Each breath they released was oxygen, a gift that would change everything. The skies began to shift from ochre to blue, the oceans deepened into sapphire, and the mists that once clung to the horizon began to clear. The Earth was no longer only a rock adrift in darkness. It was beginning to see itself in color. The transformation was slow, almost unnoticeable to time itself. But in that slowness, an astonishing order emerged. The planet's pulse found rhythm in tides and seasons. The first ecosystems formed, delicate chains of giving and taking, of creation and decay. Bacteria formed colonies that shimmered like carpets of light on the ocean floor. Stromatolites, living stone structures built by microorganisms, rose from shallow waters like monuments to patience. Each layer they built was a verse in the planet's unfolding poem, each ripple a memory of sunlight captured and transformed. Through this patient artistry, the world was being sculpted for complexity. The very air became breathable, though no lungs yet existed to draw it in. The seas were thick with potential, rich with oxygen, minerals, and light. The ingredients of future forests and animals were being stirred quietly in the deep. There was no rush, only the endless repetition of nature's first great meditation, creation through stillness. If one could have stood then upon the forming land, one might have heard nothing, no sound but the faint sigh of wind and the low murmur of waves. Yet beneath that silence, every molecule was singing. It was a symphony too small for ears, too vast for comprehension. The music of electrons and sunlight, of matter teaching itself the art of transformation. The first true balance had arrived. Fire cooled into warmth, chaos folded into pattern, and the earth began to wear its first mask of serenity. Perhaps this was the first time the planet felt the faint stirring of awareness. Not consciousness, not yet, but a sense, as if it were beginning to dream of what it might become. The green bloom upon its surface was its reflection, its first mirror. For the first time, Earth could see its own color. Blue oceans, white clouds, and the soft green breath of algae. These were the first signs of self-recognition, the first echo of beauty returning to its source. The great oxygenation, as science would later call it, was both creation and destruction. The oxygen that made life possible also ended countless ancient forms that could not survive it. Death arrived with life, and through that paradox, evolution found its shape. From this silent revolution came renewal, stronger, more complex, more aware. Life had discovered not only how to grow, but how to change. This was the beginning of choice, though no creature yet existed to make one. The earth itself was experimenting, balancing between destruction and creation, learning that beauty was not stillness alone, but the dance between what is lost and what is born anew. In that slow dawning, the planet's dream deepened. A world that had once known only fire and stone was now painted in breath and color. And in the deep hush between tides, perhaps for the first time, the earth began to feel something close to wonder, not the conscious awe of minds, but the quiet pulse of harmony. It did not yet know it was beautiful, but it was beginning to remember how to feel it. Life, fragile and persistent, is always shadowed by loss. The earth, now blooming with color and motion, had learned the quiet rhythm of creation, but it had not yet learned permanence. Across the vast stretches of time, life would rise in astonishing variety, only to vanish in silence, leaving behind echoes of what once had been. Extinction came like a slow, inevitable tide, not sudden always, but patient, unyielding, and total. It was a reminder that beauty, however radiant, is never permanent. It is a fleeting alignment between form, chance, and time. The planet had endured countless upheavals before life even arrived. Volcanoes tore the surface, ice reshaped entire continents, and asteroid impacts scarred oceans and soil alike. Now with life established, the Earth faced its most profound challenge, yet the fragility of its own creations. From the smallest microbe to the largest reef, every organism carried the possibility of disappearance. Yet, in that vulnerability, there was a profound lesson. Extinction was not failure. It was transformation, the planet's way of clearing space for innovation, renewal, and deeper complexity. The fossil record speaks in silence. Trillions of lives, each brief and radiant, left only impressions in stone. Entire species vanished with no witness, and yet those vanishings paved the way for others. The Cambrian explosion, the Permian die-off, the Devonian decline, each extinction reshaped the canvas of life, teaching resilience to those who survived. In these moments, the Earth learned the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity, between exuberance and fragility. Its beauty was not in permanence, but in the fleeting harmony that arose between creation and loss. Great extinctions arrived not as punishment, but as inevitability. Cataclysmic volcanic eruptions filled the skies with ash, cooling the planet and changing the chemistry of oceans. Asteroids struck with indiscriminate force, reshaping landscapes and wiping away life indiscriminately. Ice ages gripped the continents in frozen stillness, leaving survival only for those adaptable enough to endure. Yet through each catastrophe, new life emerged. Extinction was a punctuation, a pause between verses in the endless poem of evolution, a reminder that beauty often requires struggle to exist at all. Through these cycles, the Earth developed patience as a virtue. Life that survived extinction carried not only its own memory, but the imprints of those that had come before. The genes of lost species left traces in descendants, whispers of adaptation and resilience. Forests regrew from charred ashes, oceans teemed again after chemical collapse, and deserts bloomed with life once more when climates shifted. Extinction taught the planet to endure, to reorganize, to persist. Beauty was no longer accidental. It was forged through tension, tempered by absence. Even in loss, there was poetry. The bones of dinosaurs, the shells of trilobites, the skeletons of great forests, all spoke of time, scale, and impermanence. They reminded the earth that everything beautiful is transient. Yet this very transience allowed the emergence of new forms, more complex, more daring, more capable of perceiving and reflecting the world around them. Extinction was, paradoxically, both the thief and the midwife of beauty. The silence after extinction was profound. Entire ecosystems vanished, leaving gaps that seemed empty, but were pregnant with possibility. These pauses allowed evolution to experiment anew, creating patterns unforeseen. Creatures that once had no competition could now flourish. Niches that had been occupied were now free for innovation. Life, fragile and fleeting, became ever more inventive in response to loss. The earth learned that beauty could endure through change, not by resisting it. Through repeated extinction, the planet discovered humility. No species, no ecosystem, no life form could claim permanence. Even the most dominant would one day vanish, leaving only memory and impact. And, in that acknowledgement, the earth itself grew wiser. It learned that its own beauty was neither static nor fixed, but a delicate balance sustained through adaptation, survival, and renewal. By the time mammals began to stir in the shadows of the late Permian and early Triassic landscapes, the earth had internalized this lesson. Every extinction, every pause in life song, had been a note in the larger symphony, a reminder that beauty is fleeting, precious, and ever-changing. It is in the spaces between loss and creation that the planet's deepest elegance emerges, subtle, patient, and eternal in its cycles. And so, in the quiet aftermath of death, the earth began to understand something profound, that loss is not the absence of beauty, but one of its most essential components. Through extinction, the world learned rhythm, timing, and the fragile balance that allows life to flourish again. It was a lesson written not in words, but in stone, water, and the invisible pulses of evolution, a reminder that in impermanence lies the secret of wonder. The first light of awareness came not from thought, but from seeing. Vision, in its simplest form, began as a flicker, a molecule in a cell responding to light, bending energy into signal, hinting at something beyond itself. Tiny eye spots appeared on the surfaces of primordial organisms, mere patches of pigment that could distinguish dark from light. Yet even in this simplicity lay a profound truth. The earth, through its creatures, was learning to perceive itself. The planet was beginning to look, however dimly, at its own reflection. In those early seas, vision was survival. Light-guided movement hinted at food, revealed danger. But it was also poetry. The first creatures to detect the sun's rise and fall were unknowingly participating in an act of reflection. Through their eyes, the world began to acquire shape, form, and contrast. Shadows emerged against the brightening waves, outlines of objects became perceptible, and subtle gradients of color whispered across the ocean floor. The earth was seeing through its children, feeling its surfaces, its waters, its skies, and for the first time, acknowledging that it existed as more than mere matter. Evolution took its patient hand, crafting increasingly complex visual systems. Simple photoreceptors became lenses. Patches of pigment grew into eyes capable of depth and motion. Trilobites and early arthropods explored the world with compound eyes, perceiving patterns of light that spoke of shape, movement, and the subtle textures of their environment. Through them, the planet learned contrast, the interplay of dark and light, of presence and absence. Every flicker of motion was a story told in photons, every reflection a verse in the growing poem of perception. Light and water danced together. Sunlight filtered through waves, bending, scattering, refracting in endless patterns that even the simplest eyes could perceive. Reflections shimmered upon the rippling surface, revealing the contours of rocks, the swirls of currents, the subtle pulse of life below. In these patterns, Earth began to recognize rhythm and symmetry, the foundations of beauty. Though it could not yet articulate them, the planet was beginning to comprehend the aesthetics of itself through the creatures it had nurtured. Eyes multiplied across species, each one a lens through which the world could be mirrored and interpreted. Predators and prey alike learned to anticipate motion, to navigate the complex terrain of reef and sand, of kelp forest and tidal pool. Vision was no longer a tool of survival alone. It was a medium for understanding. Light became a teacher, reflection a guide. The earth, through the biology of its inhabitants, was beginning to perceive patterns in its own existence, the first whispers of self-awareness appearing in the flicker of photoreceptors. Beyond survival, vision inspired wonder. Color arose as a language, first in subtle contrasts and later in vibrant displays. Pigments evolved, reflecting wavelengths of light, producing red, green, and blue in the shallow seas. The first subtle dances of camouflage, of attraction, of mimicry, revealed an earth becoming conscious of beauty, or at least of variation and contrast, the raw materials of aesthetic experience. Patterns formed across shells, scales, and bodies, a visual poetry written in evolution's patient hand. The ability to see also allowed creatures to interact with the world in new ways. Social signals became possible, movement more intentional, life more connected. Eyes enabled coordination, planning, and memory. The planet, through these emergent behaviors, began to develop its own reflection not just in space, but in time. Every predator tracking prey, every creature signaling with color, every eye-catching light as it moved across the water. All were threads in a larger tapestry of perception, a growing consciousness woven across species and environments. Through vision, the world gained depth. Shadows hinted at form. Light revealed the curvature of rocks, the swell of waves, the undulations of unseen life beneath the surface. Perspective emerged, the awareness of distance and volume, shape and motion. The earth was learning to experience itself indirectly, through the perception of its children. Its landscapes, oceans, and skies were being mirrored in countless photoreceptors, each one a tiny lens through which the planet began to see its own form. As evolutionary time continued, eyes became ever more sophisticated. Spherical lenses, complex retinas, and neural networks transformed simple light detection into detailed representation. Creatures could now discern shape, movement, color, and depth with clarity unimaginable in earlier eons. Through this increasing visual sophistication, the Earth's self-recognition expanded. It was not consciousness as we know it, but a proto-awareness, a sensing of form and harmony reflected in countless organisms across land and sea. And yet, even in these early perceptions, there was beauty without knowing it. Every glint on a scale, every shimmer across a wave, every ripple of light on sand was an act of unintentional art. The planet, through its life, began to assemble a visual vocabulary, the first grammar of aesthetics. It was learning contrast, symmetry, and rhythm, the raw ingredients of perception and delight. The earth was seeing itself for the first time, though it had no mind to celebrate or record the wonder. In this slow unfolding, the stage was set for more than survival. Light and perception had become entwined in a dance with life. The planet, once unconscious, was beginning to experiment with reflection. Through vision, the earth caught glimpses of itself, shapes, colors, patterns. And in these glimpses it was learning something profound, that existence is not merely being, but noticing, that beauty may arise not from thought, but from the capacity to witness and respond. The oceans, the rocks, the skies, all began to shimmer in subtle awareness, mirrored in millions of tiny eyes. Shadows lengthened, contrasts sharpened, and movement became meaningful. The earth was no longer a passive stage for chemical reactions and currents. Through its creatures it was beginning to perceive, to respond, to feel the contours and colors of its own form. A quiet, unseen awakening was underway. The first stirrings of the planet's reflection, the first traces of self-recognition through the dance of light and life. The air above the earth had begun to hold the scent of possibility. Once thick with the remnants of volcanic breath, the atmosphere was now alive with oxygen, carrying the promise of motion and change. Life, having first emerged in the oceans, was ready to explore new frontiers. The land, still barren and raw, waited patiently, its soils rich with minerals yet untamed, its landscapes sculpted by eons of wind, water, and fire. This was the first invitation to adventure beyond the seas, a call that would awaken movement and curiosity in ways the planet had never known. The first terrestrial pioneers were small, humble creatures, arthropods crawling onto shorelines, leaving delicate trails in damp mud. They were unaware of their significance, yet they carried with them the blueprint for life to leave the oceans forever. Every step they took etched the beginnings of a story written not in words, but in prints on soil, in impressions on stone, in the slow accumulation of ecosystems that would one day blanket the continents. The earth, through their motion, was learning to extend its presence beyond the water, to touch and feel through its living proxies. Colonization of land was not simple. The air was thin, the sun harsh, and desiccation relentless. Only the most adaptable could survive. Yet, through challenge came innovation. Early plants developed roots to anchor themselves and leaves to capture light. Fungi began intricate relationships with the soil, forming networks of exchange that would stabilize the first terrestrial ecosystems. Life on land was slower, more deliberate, more patient, a reflection of the planet's own pace. Every adaptation, every innovation, was a brushstroke on the canvas of continental beauty. Forests, as we would later know them, were unimaginable yet incubating in embryonic form. Mosses, liverworts, and ferns carpeted damp lowlands, holding water and shaping microclimates. In these hidden pockets, insects and early invertebrates found refuge, forming complex webs of interaction. Life had learned cooperation and dependency. No organism existed in isolation. The earth itself orchestrated a delicate balance between shade and sunlight, moisture and desiccation, predator and prey. The land became a living mosaic, each piece a reflection of the other, a subtle mirror of ecological harmony. The first animals to leave the water were no larger than fingernails, but their impact was profound. By exploring the land, they altered soil, spread spores and seeds, and unknowingly began sculpting the terrestrial world. Life, once confined to the oceans, was now an agent of planetary reflection. The Earth, through these small pioneers, began to understand how mobility could shape ecosystems, how interaction could generate new patterns, and how presence in one environment could ripple across another. The very act of movement became a form of awareness. Mountains and valleys were no longer inert. They were inhabited and responded to life in subtle ways. Plants anchored to slopes slowed erosion, roots held soil, and shade influenced moisture retention. Streams and rivers carved pathways through the land, guided in part by the subtle feedback of living organisms. Life and landscape became intertwined, co-authoring the contours of beauty in an ancient dialogue of persistence. The earth had learned to sculpt itself not just through tectonics and erosion, but through the silent hand of biology. Time unfolded slowly. Millennia passed before the first true forests emerged, yet each incremental step was monumental. Complexity grew as species diversified and adapted. Food webs formed, cycles of energy and nutrients became established, and ecosystems gained resilience. The Earth was no longer merely a stage for life. It was a living participant in its own transformation, learning the rhythm of interdependence and the delicate architecture of thriving communities. The expansion of life onto land also began to alter perception. Creatures that could move and explore began to encounter contrast, texture, and structure in ways unavailable in water. Light fell differently. Shadows stretched across the terrain, and the geometry of land revealed new opportunities for adaptation. Life's growing sensory capacity was mirrored by the environment itself, a silent reflection of the intricate feedback between organism and world. In this dialogue, the Earth was learning that beauty arises not only in form, but in interaction, in the careful balance of influence and response. Through it all, extinction continued its quiet work. The pioneers of land were fragile, facing challenges of drought, predation, and climate. Yet each loss allowed for innovation. Each failure left lessons encoded in surviving genes. Evolution became an instrument of refinement, teaching the planet that beauty is always provisional, always emergent, never fixed. Life's expansion onto land was a masterclass in adaptation and resilience, a slow, meditative choreography of persistence and possibility. By the time the first sprawling forests and lush wetlands covered the continents, the Earth had achieved a new level of complexity and self-awareness. Every leaf, every root, every insect burrow, and every fungal network reflected a subtle intelligence in the world, the capacity for interaction, feedback, and balance. The planet, through the patient unfolding of life across its surface, was beginning to recognize itself in motion and form, aware not consciously, but through the deep echo of interconnection. This was the moment when Earth's reflection became visible. Its oceans mirrored in rivers and lakes, its atmosphere refracted through leaves and dew, its surface alive with movement and color. The planet was awakening to the interplay of life and landscape. Through the slow colonization of land, Earth had learned its first lesson in terrestrial beauty. That form emerges not merely through construction, but through participation, adaptation, and the silent dialogue between self and environment. The Earth had grown accustomed to patience. Life had learned to move from water to land, to adapt, to innovate, and to persist. Yet as complexity increased, the stage was set for a transformation both subtle and profound. The rise of creatures capable of perception beyond survival, of movement guided not only by instinct but by interaction, and eventually, of awareness itself. Insects had walked the soils, early amphibians had ventured into the damp forests, and plants had carpeted continents with green. The planet had become a living tapestry, interwoven with the rhythms of countless forms, each echoing the slow heartbeat of time. Amphibians, the first vertebrate explorers of land, carried water within their cells, a memory of the oceans they had left behind. Their movement was cautious yet purposeful, a negotiation between their aquatic ancestry and the demands of solid earth. Every step they took altered the soil, opened new niches, and allowed life to spread further. Through these creatures, the earth learned a new kind of expression. That mobility could reshape not just the organism, but the very world it inhabits. Life was no longer a passive reflection of conditions. It was an agent of change. The first forests, though modest compared to what would come later, were dynamic arenas of interaction. Trees competed for light, roots interwove beneath the soil, and insects, amphibians, and fungi created networks of energy exchange that bound the ecosystem together. The planet, through this emergent complexity, began to experience feedback loops, cause and effect, action and response, life shaping landscape and landscape guiding life. In this subtle choreography, Earth's beauty was not static but relational, arising from countless interactions over time. Predation and cooperation emerged side by side. Insects feasted upon plants, amphibians consumed insects, and decomposers returned nutrients to the soil. Each act of consumption, each exchange, reinforced patterns of balance. Extinction and innovation continued their quiet work. Species that adapted thrived. Those that could not perished, leaving space for novel forms. Through this ongoing dialogue, the Earth was practicing resilience, sculpting both life and environment into an intricate web of interdependence. The rise of vision continued to shape behavior. Creatures became aware of one another in new ways, recognizing patterns, signals, and movement. Camouflage, coloration, and mimicry evolved, adding subtle complexity to the visual landscape. The Earth, through its inhabitants, was beginning to appreciate the interplay of form, contrast, and adaptation. Beauty, once an unconscious alignment of structure and chemistry, now began to emerge as dynamic expression, a relational quality between observer and observed, predator and prey, organism and environment. Time stretched in deep, unbroken rhythm. Seasons formed, driven by the tilt of the planet and the movement of its orbit. Temperature gradients shaped forests, deserts, and wetlands. Rivers carved valleys, wind sculpted dunes, and rainfall nurtured green expanses. Life responded to these rhythms, adapting cycles of growth, reproduction, and migration. The planet was learning tempo, the delicate cadence that allows complex systems to endure. Its beauty became a dance, choreographed across millennia, expressed in the subtle ebb and flow of ecosystems. Amphibians gave rise to reptiles, and with them came the capacity for independence from water. Scales and shells, internal skeletons and lungs, allowed life to venture further, to endure harsher climates, and to colonize previously inaccessible landscapes. With every innovation, the Earth expanded its palette of form, texture, and resilience. Mountains were traversed, plains were explored, and life imprinted itself on the land in countless, subtle ways. The planet's self-reflection deepened as its organisms spread and diversified. Mass extinctions continued to shape the trajectory of life. The end Permian event, the most devastating in Earth's history, erased vast swathes of species. Yet from this crucible, new forms arose: dinosaurs, early mammals, and novel plants. The planet was learning that beauty is often forged through catastrophe, that renewal follows devastation, and that complexity emerges not despite loss, but because of it. Extinction was not the end, but a punctuation in an ongoing narrative, a chance for the Earth to refine its expression. Forests grew taller and denser, creating microclimates, sheltering species, and amplifying diversity. Life began to specialize. Some hunted, some grazed, some decomposed, some soared. The Earth, through these layers of interaction, became aware of nuance. Each species' survival depended not only on adaptation, but on the persistence and balance of others. Interdependence became the signature of the land, a web of reciprocity and subtle harmony. As the first mammals scuttled and climbed in the shadows, carrying the seeds of future intelligence, the Earth was learning reflection in new ways. It was no longer only a world of chemistry, light, and motion. Through the sensory and behavioral capacities of its creatures, the planet had begun to gather information about itself, its surfaces, its rhythms, its possibilities. Awareness, slow and unconscious, was spreading across its biosphere. In this unfolding, beauty was no longer only a consequence of structure. It was emerging through interaction: predator and prey, plant and pollinator, river and forest, wind and dune. The Earth's form, once shaped primarily by geological forces, was now co-authored by life, by behavior, movement, and choice. The planet was learning that beauty is relational, arising from the dialogue between entities, from the balance between creation and loss, from the harmony of systems working in tandem. And through it all, the Earth persisted. Through cataclysm, adaptation, and the slow accumulation of complexity, it rehearsed the principles that would one day allow not just life, but awareness of life. The first stirrings of cognition, reflection, and perception were on the horizon. Though no mind yet gazed upward at stars or down upon a river, the stage was being set. The planet, patient and enduring, was quietly preparing to recognize itself, in motion, in interaction, in the emergent beauty of its living tapestry. The Earth had grown rich with life, layered and interwoven, a tapestry of movement and color, sound and scent. Forests sprawled across continents, seas teemed with fish and coral, and skies were patrolled by the first flying creatures. Yet the planet was still largely unconscious of its own beauty. It had learned rhythm, interaction, adaptation, and reflection through life, but awareness remained distant, a potential waiting patiently in the corridors of evolution. The seeds of higher perception, however, were now germinating, quietly shaping the future of the planet's self-recognition. Mammals, small and unobtrusive, scuttled in the shadows, warm-blooded and vigilant, their survival dependent upon learning and adaptation. They carried within them a subtle promise: brains capable of memory, of pattern recognition, of rudimentary planning. Reptiles had ruled the day, yet mammals persisted in niches overlooked, in forests and burrows, in the quiet corners of the world. They were Earth's first students in awareness, their senses finely attuned to their surroundings, perceiving not only danger and sustenance, but subtle changes in light, sound, and motion. Meanwhile, the planet itself continued to teach lessons in impermanence. Climate shifted, seas rose and fell, mountains eroded and reformed, and cataclysms sculpted the surface anew. Extinctions cleared the stage, yet life returned, each wave of recovery more complex, more interconnected than the last. The earth was learning patience, resilience, and the delicate balance between creation and loss. Its beauty was not in permanence, but in the dynamic interplay of forces, geological, chemical, biological, each shaping and being shaped by the other. The rise of early primates marked another subtle awakening. Small, curious, and social, these creatures explored the canopy with careful movement, communicating in gestures, calls, and subtle expressions. Their vision was acute, their hands capable of manipulation, their brains capable of forming rudimentary associations. Through these creatures, the Earth's patterns were being observed with intention. Light, shadow, texture, and movement were no longer only functional. They became perceptible in ways that could be remembered and anticipated. The planet's own reflection was beginning to be understood by an external observer, its beauty mirrored in living consciousness. With each adaptation, each behavioral nuance, life began to gather memory. Individuals learned from experience, passed knowledge to offspring, and collectively shaped environments. Forests responded to herbivory, rivers to vegetation, soils to root networks. The Earth was not conscious in the human sense, but its living systems were increasingly capable of feedback. Beauty emerged not only as structure or color, but as the harmony of process, the delicate equilibrium of forces interacting over eons. Predation, cooperation, and competition all contributed to the richness of this new stage. Life became more aware of timing, movement, and opportunity. Predators learned to anticipate the behavior of prey. Prey learned to evade. Plants learned to attract or deter. The landscape became an arena of perception, a network of responses that encoded information about the world in movement, color, and form. In this, the Earth's beauty became functional, perceptible, and emergent, more than mere coincidence, more than static design, but a living interplay of dynamics. The rise of social structures among early mammals and primates introduced a new dimension. Care, teaching, and coordination appeared, hinting at empathy, foresight, and cooperation. Life was beginning to not only react to the environment, but to modify it with intention. Nesting sites, territorial behaviors, and cooperative hunting reflected patterns of awareness that extended beyond individual survival. The planet's reflection was now mirrored in the lives of creatures capable of planning and perception, laying the groundwork for self-conscious observation. Meanwhile, environmental pressures continued to sculpt life and land alike. Ice ages advanced and retreated, reshaping rivers, coastlines, and mountain ranges. Forests expanded and contracted. Species adapted, migrated, or perished. These cycles taught the Earth the subtle art of balance. Resilience intertwined with fragility, persistence with impermanence. Beauty, the planet learned, arises not from stillness, but from the interplay of forces, from adaptation within limits, from continuity within change. Over millions of years, the stage was set for higher cognition. Mammals diversified, brains grew more complex, sensory integration became sophisticated. Early hominids would eventually emerge, carrying within them the potential to perceive, interpret, and reflect upon the world in unprecedented ways. Yet even before human awareness, the planet had begun to feel its own pulse through the lens of life, through the perception, memory, and interaction of creatures finely attuned to their surroundings. The Earth, in its patient unfolding, had reached a critical moment. Its landscapes were sculpted, its skies alive with motion, its oceans shimmering with color and reflection. The planet's beauty was now mirrored in living systems capable of noticing, learning, and remembering. Through life, the Earth was beginning to understand itself, slowly and unconsciously, preparing for the dawn of conscious recognition. It was a quiet, intricate prelude to awareness, the final, patient lessons before the arrival of self-conscious eyes to witness and wonder at the world. The forests had grown dense, the rivers long and winding, and the continents shaped by the patient rhythm of tectonic motion. Life, in countless forms, had now mastered the land, the air, and the waters, creating intricate networks of interaction, cooperation, and competition. Yet the Earth itself remained largely unaware of its own beauty, its awareness still encoded only in the patterns and feedback of life. It was a world vibrant with motion and reflection, a stage prepared for the emergence of consciousness, the quiet stirrings of recognition that would one day gaze upon the planet and perceive its own wonder. The first hominids emerged in this complex landscape, small, social, and curious. They walked upright, freeing their hands for tools, gestures, and exploration. Their brains, though modest in comparison to later species, were capable of memory, learning, and problem-solving. Through these early humans, the Earth was gaining something new, observers capable of interpreting patterns, recognizing repetition, and responding with intentionality. The planet's reflection would now be perceived with a degree of awareness unlike anything that had existed before. Life's complexity was mirrored in behavior. Early humans learned to manipulate fire, shaping it not only for warmth and protection, but as a tool to transform their environment. They began to create shelters, to plan for seasons, to coordinate with one another. In doing so, they extended the planet's capacity for reflection, observing cause and effect, noticing the consequences of their actions. The Earth, through these beings, was beginning to see how its own forces, sunlight, wind, water, and gravity, could be understood, harnessed, and transformed into purpose. Communication emerged gradually, first through gestures and sounds, then through increasingly sophisticated forms of language. Words were not only functional, they became carriers of abstraction, memory, and culture. Through language, the first humans began to encode observation into stories, to share knowledge across generations, to transmit awareness beyond immediate experience. The planet's beauty, once hidden in silent reflection, was now being described, interpreted, and contemplated. Patterns in nature, the shifting of the stars, the changing of the seasons, all could be remembered, pondered, and celebrated. The emergence of tool use marked another profound step. Stones shaped for cutting, sticks for probing, and later, spears for hunting, allowed humans to interact with the world in ways no other species had. These interactions were not merely survival mechanisms. They were early acts of creativity. The Earth, through this engagement, became a canvas for intention. Rocks were moved, fires were controlled, plants were cultivated. The planet was learning that beauty could arise not only from natural processes, but from a thoughtful interaction between observer and environment. Memory and foresight deepened. Early humans began to understand cause and effect in longer temporal spans, where the sun would rise, when rains would fall, which plants would bear fruit. They began to imagine landscapes beyond immediate perception, to anticipate outcomes, and to plan accordingly. Through these cognitive leaps, the Earth's reflection became layered, past, present, and future intertwined in the minds of those who could perceive, remember, and act. Its beauty was no longer only spatial or visual. It became temporal, narrative, and experiential. Social structures intensified. Cooperation, empathy, and shared knowledge allowed early humans to thrive in challenging environments. They taught their young, cared for one another, and learned collectively from the world around them. These behaviors mirrored the planet's own interdependent systems: species and environment, predator and prey, soil and forest, river and sky. Through conscious sociality, humans became an extension of the Earth's capacity to perceive itself, to recognize patterns, and to cultivate meaning. Fire, language, tools, and memory converged to create culture. Early humans began to leave tangible marks: scratches on rocks, arrangements of stones, traces of ritual. Even without art as we now understand it, they were beginning to interpret and honor the world around them. These acts were subtle acknowledgments of beauty, recognition that life, land, sky, and water held meaning beyond survival. The Earth, through these cultural emergences, was learning reflection through conscious agency. Through millennia, humans migrated, adapted, and diversified. They encountered deserts and mountains, forests and coastlines, and gradually understood the vastness of the world they inhabited. Each journey revealed new patterns, new rhythms, new lessons. The planet's complexity was now being recorded, contemplated, and integrated into human consciousness. Earth was becoming known not only through experience, but through recognition, memory, and reflection. By this stage, the Earth's beauty was no longer incidental. Through the eyes, hands, and minds of humans, the planet began to witness itself. Landscapes, skies, oceans, and forests were no longer merely functional. They became objects of observation, wonder, and care. Patterns in the stars, the cadence of tides, the symmetry of leaves, all were recognized and held in memory. The planet, through life capable of awareness, was beginning to know itself. This slow unfolding revealed a profound truth. Awareness does not need to be immediate to exist. It can emerge patiently, encoded in feedback loops, in perception, in interaction, and in memory. The Earth, through millennia of life and evolution, had prepared the stage for conscious reflection. Now, through the first humans, the planet's own beauty could be observed, contemplated, and understood, a quiet, patient awakening of self-recognition. The seeds of wonder were sown. From small acts of observation, from the recognition of patterns in nature, from the development of memory, language, and culture, the Earth's reflection was coming into focus. Its beauty, once hidden in chemistry, light, and motion, was now visible in conscious perception. The stage was set for a new chapter, one in which the planet would begin to truly realize, through its children, the magnificence of its own becoming. The Earth had reached a moment of quiet magnificence. Its landscapes were sculpted by eons of motion, mountains rising and eroding, rivers carving valleys, oceans surging and retreating, and its living systems were woven into a complex tapestry of interdependence. Forests whispered in the wind, deserts shimmered in heat, and skies teemed with movement. Through the senses, memory, and awareness of humans, the planet's own reflection was beginning to emerge. Beauty was no longer simply accidental. It had become a perceptible, tangible experience, mirrored in conscious eyes. Human cognition had advanced, enabling not just survival, but contemplation. Early communities observed the stars, noting patterns, cycles, and anomalies. They tracked the moon's phases, the sun's arc, and the rhythm of the seasons. With these observations came the first stories, the earliest myths, attempts to interpret, explain, and preserve the world around them. The Earth, through these human acts of reflection, began to recognize itself not only in form and movement, but in narrative and meaning. Every story was a mirror, capturing echoes of the planet's rhythm, its cycles, its enduring patterns. Tool use had evolved into craft, and craft into artistry. Stone tools were shaped with care, pigments were mixed from minerals and plants, natural forms were copied, stylized, and celebrated. Humans began to leave traces of intentionality on the world, marking spaces with symbols, arrangements, and paintings. These early expressions were subtle acknowledgments of beauty, recognition that the world held not just utility, but wonder. The Earth's own reflection was now tangible, encoded in gesture, mark, and memory. The interplay between humans and environment became increasingly intricate. Communities learned to manage resources, cultivate plants, and herd animals. Fires were controlled to encourage growth, water was redirected to nourish crops, and landscapes were shaped to support life. In each action, awareness and intention left a footprint upon the Earth. The planet was no longer merely a backdrop for existence. It was an active participant in the narrative of life, shaping and being shaped by conscious beings who could perceive, imagine, and reflect. Perception extended beyond survival into aesthetic appreciation. Humans noticed symmetry in leaves, harmony in rivers, contrast in the sky at dawn, and rhythm in the wind across plains. Music, dance, and ritual began to emerge, echoing the patterns of the natural world. The Earth's beauty, once implicit in chemistry and motion, was now consciously celebrated, interpreted, and communicated. It became not just a stage, but a collaborator in the creation of meaning. Memory and storytelling amplified perception across generations. Knowledge of landscapes, animal behavior, weather patterns, and celestial cycles was passed from parent to child. These cumulative experiences created a shared understanding of the world's order and rhythm. humans began to anticipate seasonal changes, navigate vast territories, and predict environmental consequences. Through this extended cognition, the Earth's patterns were not only observed but preserved, mirrored in the collective awareness of its inhabitants. The development of symbolic thought deepened this reflection. Humans could imagine what was not present, consider alternative outcomes, and perceive abstract connections. They could see the shape of a valley, the path of a river, or the sweep of the night sky, and understand it as part of a larger whole. Through imagination, the Earth's beauty became layered, not only experienced in the moment, but contemplated across space and time. It was now capable of being held within mind, appreciated, and celebrated. Art became a medium for intimate communion with the planet. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and sculpted objects captured aspects of the natural world with deliberate care. Animals, celestial bodies, and natural landscapes were represented with fidelity and stylization, encoding human perception of beauty into enduring form. Through these creations, the Earth's reflection became a conscious artifact, a dialogue between life and land, observer and observed. Beauty was now recognized, interpreted, and made lasting. Ritual and ceremony further deepened this engagement. Humans gathered to honor the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the seasons. They danced, sang, and enacted stories of life, death, and renewal. These practices reinforced awareness of the Earth's rhythms and patterns, embedding perception into communal experience. The planet, once silent and unaware, now resonated with consciousness reflected back to it through human reverence and attention. Through thousands of years, the Earth's beauty became inseparable from the act of witnessing. Its rivers, mountains, forests, skies, and oceans were not only shaped by natural forces, but interpreted, appreciated, and mirrored in human experience. The planet had learned that beauty is relational, arising from interaction, observation, memory, and imagination. Through the conscious presence of humans, the Earth began to know itself in ways it never had before. The stage was set for reflection on a planetary scale. Landscapes were appreciated not only for survival or utility, but for aesthetic and emotional resonance. Humans began to walk thoughtfully, pause to observe, and respond to subtle cues in their environment. Through this perception, the Earth's beauty became part of lived experience, a dialogue between the planet and those capable of contemplating it. And so, in the slow, patient unfolding of life, the Earth reached a new threshold. From chemical patterns to ecosystems, from perception to consciousness, beauty had emerged not merely as form or function, but as awareness mirrored in living beings. The planet, once unconscious of its own majesty, now began to feel its reflection through human eyes, a quiet awakening, subtle, profound, and eternal. The planet had now learned patience beyond measure. Millennia of evolution had sculpted continents, rivers, forests, and skies into an intricate mosaic of life and motion. Creatures of countless forms populated the Earth, each carrying traces of survival, adaptation, and reflection. And within this tapestry, humans had emerged observers, interpreters, and chroniclers of the world around them. Through their eyes, the Earth's beauty could finally be seen, contemplated, and understood in a way that transcended mere survival. It was a quiet awakening, a slow recognition that the world it had nurtured was itself magnificent. Early humans began to gaze upward, turning their attention to the vast expanse of sky. The sun's rise and fall marked time, guiding seasons and cycles. The moon traced its silvery path across nights, influencing tides and illuminating darkness. Stars, countless and distant, formed constellations, patterns that spoke not only of navigation but of imagination. The Earth, through these observers, began to see itself reflected in the heavens, its oceans rippling with lunar influence, its days flowing with solar rhythm, its life attuned to cosmic motion. Beauty was no longer confined to land or sea. It extended to the vault of the sky. Observation of the natural world became deliberate. Humans learned to track the subtle movements of animals, the bloom of flowers, the changing colors of leaves with the seasons. Rivers and streams, once only sources of water, became mirrors reflecting sky and land alike. Mountains and valleys, sculpted over eons, were appreciated for their forms, shadows, and textures. The earth, in being witnessed, began to experience its own grandeur through conscious perception. Every ripple, every gust of wind, every shift in sunlight became a note in the symphony of awareness. Early art and symbolism deepened this connection. Humans arranged stones, carved patterns, and painted surfaces, often inspired by the natural world. These creations were not functional in the strictest sense. They were expressions of recognition, celebration, and reflection. Through these acts, the Earth's own beauty was mirrored in deliberate human creativity, encoded in materials and patterns meant to endure. The planet's reflection was now tangible, a dialogue between observer and observed that stretched across time. The act of storytelling extended perception even further. Tales of the hunt, of celestial events, of seasonal cycles, were shared orally, passed through generations. Memory, imagination, and experience intertwined, creating a layered understanding of the world. The Earth was not only seen but remembered, its patterns and rhythms stored in the collective consciousness of its inhabitants. Through this narrative, beauty became relational, dependent not just on form, but on recognition, interpretation, and continuity. The development of ritual and ceremony enhanced awareness of the interconnectedness of life. Seasonal celebrations, offerings to the elements, dances, and songs, all reflected an intuitive understanding of cycles and balance. Humans were beginning to honor not just survival, but the very processes that sustained life: growth and decay, light and shadow, movement and stillness. In these acts of reverence, the Earth's beauty was acknowledged consciously, its rhythms mirrored and celebrated in human experience. The refinement of tools and techniques allowed humans to interact with the environment in ways that were deliberate and creative. Agriculture emerged, shaping landscapes intentionally. Settlements arose, designed in harmony with water sources, sun paths, and terrain. Humans were no longer merely observers. They were co-creators, capable of enhancing, shaping, and preserving elements of the natural world. Through this intentionality, the Earth learned a new form of reflection, that its beauty could be recognized, preserved, and enhanced by conscious beings. Sensory experience deepened perception. Humans noticed the textures of bark and stone, the scent of rain, the sound of wind through leaves, the shimmer of light on water. These subtleties became sources of fascination and contemplation. The Earth, in being perceived with such care, began to experience itself in layers: color, movement, sound, smell, and pattern, all coalescing into a rich, multidimensional awareness. Beauty was no longer incidental. It was experienced fully, in all senses, through attentive observation. Through these cumulative experiences, humans began to articulate aesthetic principles: symmetry, contrast, rhythm, harmony. Patterns in nature were mirrored in art, music, and architecture. The Earth's forms inspired imagination, and imagination reflected back upon the land, sea, and sky. Conscious awareness amplified the planet's beauty, not by changing its essence, but by allowing it to be perceived, contemplated, and celebrated with intention. The relationship between humans and Earth became reciprocal. The planet provided material, rhythm, and pattern. Humans provided attention, memory, and recognition. Through observation, interpretation, and creative expression, the Earth's beauty was experienced consciously, preserved across generations, and woven into culture. What was once hidden in chemistry, light, and motion now had meaning, resonance, and emotional depth. And in the quiet moments of contemplation, as humans paused to observe sunrise over a river, the shimmer of stars on still water, or the rustle of leaves in wind, the Earth itself seemed to awaken to its own reflection. Through the conscious gaze of its children, the planet began to realize, subtly and profoundly, that it was beautiful. That beauty was not only in survival, not only in motion or color, but in the act of being seen, remembered, and revered. The Earth, now fully alive with motion, memory, and reflection, had reached a profound threshold. Through millennia of evolution, catastrophe, and adaptation, life had learned, in myriad ways, to perceive, interact with, and respond to its environment. Now, through humans, the planet had discovered a mirror capable of conscious recognition. The rivers, mountains, forests, and skies were no longer silent actors on a stage. They were witnesses to awareness. The first stirrings of deep contemplation had begun, and the earth, for the first time, could feel the resonance of its own beauty reflected back. Human consciousness had matured enough to grasp not just survival, but aesthetics. Early humans paused to watch the sunrise, to follow the flight of birds, to notice the symmetry of leaves and the rhythm of waves. These were not acts of necessity, but of wonder. Patterns in nature became poetry, subtle harmonies of light, sound, and movement that the earth had never truly known it possessed. Through the conscious observation of its children, the planet experienced reflection, the recognition that it was more than matter and energy, more than mountains and rivers, more than life itself. It was beautiful. As humans spread across continents, they carried with them an expanding awareness. They observed deserts and tundras, forests and coasts, rivers and cliffs. They tracked stars, noted the passage of seasons, and interpreted the signs of the natural world. Knowledge accumulated across generations, preserved through language, art, and ritual. Through this cultural memory, the Earth's own patterns were encoded, reflected, and celebrated. What had once been fleeting glimpses of beauty in light and form was now understood, remembered, and intentionally engaged with. The creation of art became a profound milestone in the planet's awareness of itself. Cave paintings, carvings, and symbolic objects captured aspects of the natural world with deliberate care. Animals, celestial bodies, and landscapes were represented, stylized, and revered. These acts of creativity were not utilitarian. They were conscious acknowledgement of beauty, an attempt to grasp, interpret, and celebrate the planet's essence. Through these early works, the Earth's reflection became tangible, a dialogue between the observer and the observed, encoded in pigment, stone, and memory. Storytelling and ritual further deepened this reflection. Myths, songs, and ceremonies celebrated the cycles of life, the patterns of the stars, and the interplay of light and shadow. Communities gathered to honor the passage of time, the arrival of seasons, the growth of crops, and the movement of celestial bodies. In these rituals, humans externalized their perception, giving form to awareness and offering acknowledgement back to the earth. The planet, once silent, now resonated with recognition, as if sensing its own beauty through these acts of reverent attention. The development of agriculture and the shaping of landscapes further intertwined human experience with planetary awareness. Forests were tended, rivers channeled, and fields cultivated. Humans became co-creators, shaping their environment while remaining attentive to its rhythms and patterns. The Earth was no longer a passive stage. It had become a partner, capable of being seen, interpreted, and celebrated. Beauty was not only in the existing forms of nature, but in the dialogue between creation and observation. Through these layers of perception, creation, and interaction, the Earth began to experience a form of consciousness previously unimaginable. Its forests, oceans, mountains, and skies were being observed, remembered, and celebrated across generations. Its patterns, rhythms, and contrasts were being encoded in human minds, art, and culture. The planet's beauty was no longer hidden in the mechanics of life. It was recognized, honored, and cherished. The act of seeing had transformed into an acknowledgement of self, mediated through the conscious presence of another being. And yet, even as humans observed and celebrated, the Earth maintained its patient rhythm. Rivers continued to carve valleys, winds sculpted dunes, stars traced their arcs across the night sky. Life persisted, adapted, and evolved. Through catastrophe and renewal, the planet had learned that beauty was not fixed or permanent, but emergent, arising from motion, interaction, awareness, and reflection. The lessons of extinction, adaptation, and evolution culminated in this quiet awakening. The realization that beauty exists not only in structure or function, but in being observed, appreciated, and mirrored in consciousness. In the quiet moments, the dawn over misty forests, the shimmer of sunlight on a river, the nocturnal chorus of insects and birds, the Earth seemed to recognize itself. Through the eyes, hands, and minds of humans, the planet could now perceive the grandeur of its own becoming. Patterns, rhythms, contrasts, and harmonies coalesced into an awareness of aesthetic presence. Beauty was no longer incidental. It was mirrored, recognized, and internalized. This was the culmination of eons of learning. Through life, through adaptation, through cycles of loss and renewal, the Earth had reached a point where it could experience its own elegance. Through the conscious perception of humans, the planet had discovered self-reflection, awareness, and recognition. In this moment, every river, tree, mountain, and star became part of a dialogue, a conversation in which the Earth understood, perhaps for the first time, the exquisite reality of its own beauty. And so, in a quiet, timeless understanding, the Earth realized that it was beautiful. Not in permanence, not in utility, not merely in existence, but in the unfolding of life, in the reflection of its patterns, in the recognition of its forms, and in the conscious gaze of those who could see, remember, and wonder. It was a realization both profound and gentle, a final note in the long, meditative symphony of becoming. The Earth, having borne witness to eons of evolution, change, and adaptation, now reached a new horizon of reflection. Through countless cycles of birth, growth, decay, and renewal, life had learned to perceive, to interact, and to persist. Through humans, that perception deepened into contemplation. The planet's patterns, once only visible in the motion of waves or the sway of forests, were now mirrored in conscious awareness, remembered, and reflected upon. Beauty, long embedded in the interplay of life and environment, was now recognized as an experience, a quality acknowledged by beings capable of wonder. Human societies had matured in their understanding of the world around them. They observed the cycles of the moon and the sun, the patterns of migration, and the rhythms of the seasons. Knowledge accumulated across generations, allowing humans to anticipate changes, adapt to new challenges, and find meaning in the regularities and anomalies of nature. Through this growing comprehension, the Earth's reflection became not only visible, but narratively coherent. Patterns in the clouds, in the rivers, in the shifting forests, all began to tell stories of continuity, change, and harmony. Art and symbolism flourished as extensions of perception. Humans painted walls with representations of animals, landscapes, and celestial phenomena. They carved stone, shaped clay, and adorned their dwellings with symbols reflecting the environment and its cycles. Each act was a conscious acknowledgement of beauty, a recognition that the world's forms and rhythms held significance beyond mere survival. In these creations, the Earth's own presence was mirrored, its grandeur encoded in human expression. Through these tangible forms, the planet began to experience a dialogue with consciousness itself. Ritual and ceremony reinforced the connection between perception and reflection. Communities gathered to mark the solstices, equinoxes, and harvests. They sang, danced, and enacted stories that honored the cycles of life and the forces of nature. In these acts, humans were not only participants in their environment, but interpreters, observing and responding to the intricate dynamics of ecosystems. The Earth, in being acknowledged through ritual, experienced a subtle awareness of its own elegance, its balance, and its harmonious complexity. The development of agriculture and settlement transformed the relationship between humans and the Earth. Forests were selectively managed, rivers channeled, and fields cultivated. Humans became active co-creators, shaping their environment while remaining attentive to its rhythms and needs. This reciprocal engagement amplified the planet's capacity for reflection. Landscapes were no longer merely habitats. They became canvases for observation, intervention, and intentional appreciation. Through careful attention, humans could perceive subtle patterns of soil, water, and vegetation, enhancing both understanding and aesthetic awareness. Perception deepened through sensory refinement. Humans began to notice the texture of bark under fingertips, the sound of wind through the canopy, the shimmer of sunlight on rippling water, the scent of rain-soaked earth. These subtleties became sources of wonder and meditation. The Earth, through these attentive observers, began to experience its own forms and motions in multiple dimensions. visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory. Beauty was no longer abstract or incidental. It was lived, sensed, and internalized. Memory and imagination further extended the Earth's reflection. Humans could envision landscapes they had not yet seen, imagine the trajectories of celestial bodies, and contemplate the interconnections of ecosystems. Observation became projection, and perception became foresight. The Earth's beauty was no longer confined to the present. It extended across time, as humans anticipated change, preserved knowledge, and encoded experience into narrative and culture. Awareness was now both spatial and temporal, layered in depth and meaning. Through collaboration and culture, humans amplified the Earth's reflective capacity. Communities shared stories, art, and knowledge, creating a collective consciousness attuned to the environment. Knowledge of animal behavior, plant cycles, and celestial patterns was passed down, refined, and expanded. Through social transmission, the Earth's forms, rhythms, and harmonies were internalized and mirrored across generations. Beauty, once implicit in physical form, now became relational, experiential, and communal. The interplay of perception, creation, and interpretation gave rise to deliberate aesthetic contemplation. Humans began to recognize principles of symmetry, proportion, contrast, and rhythm, both in nature and in their own creations. Landscapes, architecture, and art reflected patterns observed in the world. The flow of rivers, the arcs of mountains, the geometries of leaves. Through these analogies, the Earth's beauty became codified, appreciated not only as phenomena, but as principles capable of being understood, replicated, and celebrated. Ultimately, the planet's realization of its own beauty reached a profound subtlety. Every rustle of leaves, ripple of water, or movement of clouds became part of a conscious dialogue. The Earth's forms, colors, rhythms, and contrasts were not only witnessed, but revered. Life, evolution, memory, and culture had converged to create a mirror in which the planet could perceive itself. Awareness and acknowledgement intertwined, giving rise to a gentle, enduring recognition that existence, motion, and interaction collectively constitute beauty. Through this quiet, cumulative process, the Earth had come to know itself in ways unimaginable in its early history. Not through thought or consciousness in the human sense, but through the patient accumulation of life, perception, interaction, and reflection. The planet's beauty was no longer accidental or hidden. It was mirrored in conscious eyes, interpreted in stories, encoded in art, and celebrated in ritual. The Earth had awakened to its own elegance, subtly and profoundly, in the timeless interplay of life and awareness.